Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intellis session on segment-based messaging. I am Gaurav Kapoor. I'm the president of Heuristics. I'll be leading this session, and thanks everyone for joining. Today's focus is on how do we make segmentation more actionable, and how do we actually translate or bridge the gap between segmentation and segment-based messaging. So let's just dive right in. Let's just first look at the extent of the problem or the challenge in making segmentation more actionable. Pretty much any major brand in the pharmaceutical industry has a customer segmentation. I'm specifically thinking about physician segmentation, HCP segmentation, but most brands even have some kind of a patient segmentation. They have even a payer segmentation or IDN segmentation. But if you were to look at all of their messaging materials that they are using in market, and if you were to actually sit down and say, show me how much of your messaging is targeted to specific segments, i.e. segment one gets this messaging, segment one gets that messaging, very few, maybe 10-20% of the brands would be able to show the map in how the segmentation translates into segment-based messaging. So a lot of time, effort, and money goes into segmenting customers. But one of the most important actionability items of segmentation, which is segment-based messaging, is not being achieved. So this session is dedicated to how can we actually bridge that gap and make more segmentation studies more actionable and allow brands to do segment-based messaging. Let's look at first the barriers to actionability. Why is actionability not happening in the first place? So you have a segmentation. Now, in order to first, if you want to actually do segment-based messaging, somebody's got to write segment-specific messages. This is where the first leaky bucket happens. You have a segmentation that was done by a team using certain data and certain, methodological approaches. It could be behavioral, attitudinal, whatever different approaches they use. And then it's handed over to marketing, handed over to the agency team, and to the copywriter, who eventually are writers who are eventually going to write messages. If the different stakeholders involved in this process are using different processes and different approaches or different tools to do their job, it is very likely they're not going to be able to translate the segmentation into segment-based messaging, which is one of the reasons why you actually see even the starting point of, can somebody show me where is the inventory of messages for segment one? And this inventory applies only to segment one and not the others. Even that starting point is often not achieved. Then the question is, many times the way the segmentation is done, the entire customer list is not segmented. So you have part of the customer list segmented, but not everything. So then, people start questioning whether is it really worth doing or not. And again, the tools that were used to create the segmentation and now project it to the entire customer list, they're not the same. So then that becomes a barrier. Finally, you got to implement the segmentation in the field. And for HCP segmentations or even payer segmentations, you're using one-to-one selling, personal selling. And if the reps are not trained on selling based on heuristics, they're not going to understand what they're doing. And they'll have lots of complaints about, this is too complicated. I can't change the message, every time I go see the physician, et cetera, et cetera. So these are some of the barriers as to why segment-based messaging is not happening today. And we're going to basically share with you an idea on how, if different stakeholders, whether it's the salespeople, the sales trainers, the sales ops people who are doing the targeting work, the marketing team, the agency team, the market research team, if everybody was working off of the same page, i.e. if there was such a thing as a unifying tool for segmentation, that every stakeholder was using the same tool to do their job or their part of the process, in bridging the gap from segmentation to segment-based messaging, now suddenly you can have a lot better success. And that tool is decision heuristics or decision heuristic science. Why? Let's take a look at it. First, you're going to segment customers using some information. It's behavioral, attitudinal, needs-based in demographics, psychographics. There's so many different choices. If at least part of your segmentation, if not all of it, is based on decision heuristics, you are already segmenting customers based on how they make decisions. And you are messaging to them and marketing them to change their decisions. So if you actually segment customers based on decisions, you are already starting in a better place. If you know the decision heuristics of your segments, there is already a well-established process. I mean, we're going to share that with you in a few slides on how to actually very scientifically curate language. You can literally manipulate words to talk to the decision heuristics of any segment. And so this is now the team who's writing messages can actually be using the exact same tool, which is decision heuristics. All they really need are the heuristics of each segment, and that's it. All the rest of the information about the segment profiles, etc., actually becomes noise. It is not necessary for the messaging work. Now you go over to targeting. If you can target, if you segmented customers based on their decisions and you can see decision making in the behavioral data that the targeting teams are using, you can actually map all your customers to the decision heuristics of these segments. And this now allows much better targeting actionability. And finally, so it's going opposite way. And finally, if you want to train your reps on how to sell to customers based on their decision heuristics, and helping them understand how customers make decisions and how the science behind it explains the irrational decision making, will make them much better prepared and informed on how to sell to each customer depending on their segment. They don't have to use typing tools, or they don't have to make observations about which segment of each physician fits in. That's already part of the Viva message map. They just need to better understand, why am I delivering this message to this physician, and not just do it mechanically in a rote fashion. They now already understand the intent behind it, and now they're much more prepared, and actually the whole process is a lot more rewarding for them. So let's dive into how we actually use this unifying tool to go from segmentation to segment-based messaging. You don't have to start from scratch. You could literally augment your segmentation with the heuristics information. A lot of times people already have a behavioral segmentation, which was created using some kind of secondary behavioral data. The problem with this is, while this segmentation is very useful for targeting purposes and it's actually quite accurate for that task, it is not as useful or actionable for messaging, because while you know the behaviors of each segment, you don't know why they're behaving the way they're behaving. And if you don't know why, how are you going to change the behaviors with messages? That's the whole point of messaging, is to change behaviors. So if you don't know why they're behaving the way they're behaving, now it's basically kind of shooting in the dark. So simply adding, if there was a way to figure out what are the dominant decision heuristics of each segment, and we're going to show you how to do that, you could now augment your behavioral segmentation with this heuristics data or heuristics information. And now you can ignore all the rest of the profile of the segments, the behavioral information, etc., is not necessary anymore. You can just utilize the heuristics information, and using the heuristics of each segment, you can actually create segment-specific messaging. In fact, you can also identify cross-segment heuristics that apply to all the segments or most of the segments, and you can create cross-segment messaging as well. So you have some cross-segment messages, and then you have segment-specific messages. That's actually the best way to execute. So let's look at how to augment your existing segmentation with heuristics information, or do a new segmentation from scratch. And oftentimes you may end up making a decision about, like, historically, all of us have been augmenting behavioral segmentation with attitudinal information or psychographic information. And we're proposing that potentially consider the idea that augmenting your segmentation with decision heuristics information is a lot more actionable idea, because attitudes don't correlate with behaviors. How many times have you seen an attitudinal segmentation where each of the segments has a similar prescribing behavior pattern? The share of each brand or class of drugs doesn't change by segment. Like, why is that? If their attitudes are so different, why aren't their behaviors different? So attitudes don't correlate with behaviors, and attitudes are also not that helpful in sometimes the same attitude in two different segments, the messages that they prefer are also not the same. So decision heuristics as a way of augmenting is a much more actionable variable to consider. It explains the customer's decision-making and eventually their behaviors. It can directly be used to craft language. Literally, if you know a heuristic that a segment is using, you can write messages to that heuristic in a one-to-one fashion. So potentially, I mean, you can still include attitudinal information in your segmentation, but if you really want to make your segmentation actionable and take it to segment-based messaging, decision heuristics beats attitudes hands down. So how are you going to get the heuristics of your segments? Let's talk about that. First option is conduct qualitative research. This is, you will need to find a way to very cleverly disguise interview questions that are probing into the decision heuristics and biases of respondents without them realizing what's happening. We'll show you examples. In quant research, you can actually now, you can study more than just heuristics. You can include behavioral questions, you can include attitudinal questions, etc. But even in quant research, you're still going to need to figure out how to cleverly disguise your survey questions so that you can get a respondent to show their hand. The whole, the heuristics are hidden. The respondent doesn't either know they're using a heuristic, or if the heuristic is a bias, not all heuristics are biases, but if the heuristic is a bias, then the respondent doesn't want to admit to, to using a bias to make decisions. So you have to cleverly disguise your survey or interview questions to be able to get respondents to kind of admit to it in the form of market research. We'll show you exactly how that's done in either setting, qual or quant. The other way to do this is also just using data. No primary research is actually used, just using secondary data. You start with behavioral data, and then using some heuristic rules, you try to back out of the data on what heuristics are potentially driving this physician whose data I'm analyzing. It's another approach that can potentially be more efficient from a cost and timing perspective, and maybe even more accurate. So let's look at each one. Side by side, if you were going to only use one, you didn't have, you weren't going to mix and match, then you're going to probably have to make some trade-off decisions. The data will get you probably the most accurate in assigning each physician to what heuristics they're using. Research may be, not as accurate or as reliable, but then the research can help you get a lot of other profiling data on each segment, like attitudes, beliefs, needs, psychographics, demographics, etc. So you can actually kind of make a decision that's right for your brand. We've just provided you with a checklist here on, depending on what's important to you and your marketing team, you can decide which approach is better. But let's take a look at, if you were going to use any of these three approaches, how would you actually do it? That's more important. So if you are going to use qualitative research, let's say you're recruiting 30, 50, 100 respondents, and each respondent is from a behavioral segment. Segment one, based on data alone, you already know this respondent belongs to segment one. You are now trying to figure out what heuristics they're using. How are you going to ask survey questions? So these are examples of how to cleverly disguise survey questions so that the respondent doesn't know what you're up to, but you actually get insights on whether they're using a certain heuristic or not. So let's say you were doing this in heart failure category, and you wanted to understand if this respondent is using dread risk bias heuristic. You might ask the question like you see here: is there any segment of heart failure patients you dread seeing them in your practice, i.e. if they didn't come to see you, you might actually be relieved. Or if these patients belong to some other practice, you wouldn't miss them. There are many ways to ask that question. Another question would be, let's say you were using a different heuristic. Now, this one is called ascription of causality, where physicians are kind of, in their mind thinking A causes B, even though they don't really actually have medical evidence to conclusively say that. So now you could ask them a question like this. Let's say you have 5 heart failure patients who closely follow your recommendations. They're very similar demographically, but they have very different progression of the disease. What would help explain the difference in progression and in outcomes? So now you might be able to understand if this physician is using ascription or causality heuristic or not. So these are just suggestions. We're not going to go through all of them, but you can get the idea for you need to disguise the intent in your interviewing. You'll have to very carefully. First of all, you need to start with a short list of heuristics you want to study in that interview, because you can't study like hundreds of heuristics, which there are 650 plus heuristics that have been identified so far. So you need to figure out first which ones you want to study, and then for each heuristic, you need to find ways to cleverly disguise the intent of questioning in the form of some kind of a projective interview technique. Now, if you were doing this in a quant survey, it would look different. You would use a different approach. Here's some couple of ideas on how you could do it in quant. In a quant setting, you could potentially consider using something like a social proverb. Let's say if you were to, as a proxy for a heuristic, so let's say you were to ask a survey question, to what extent does the following statement describes how you make treatment decisions in chronic heart failure? And the statement is, all's well that ends well. So this is a saying, a social saying or a proverb that everyone knows what it means. The physician knows what it means. Now, in heart failure, it could have a different interpretation or a different manifestation for what that saying means. And if the physician does think like that, they're already kind of sort of making decisions like that. They may score that social proverb high. And does it describe how you make treatment decisions in chronic heart failure? Well, that social proverb actually maps really well to a heuristic called peak and rule. And now you've very cleverly gotten the respondent to tell you that they're using peak and rule without actually them having any idea of what you were doing. You can also disguise heuristics inside messages. So if you write a message to peak and rule heuristic, and you show lots of messages to respondents in a quant survey, and they find certain messages much more motivating than others, then the language in that message that was written to a specific heuristic, it basically becomes a proxy. If they find a message highly persuasive, then they find the heuristic inside that message highly relevant. This is also a rule of thumb that you can actually utilize to identify the specific heuristics of each respondent in a quantitative research setting. Now let's look at the last one, which is like if you're not doing any research at all, you don't have time or budget, and you're just doing data. I mean, you're already using secondary data to kind of create the target list or do all sorts of analyses. You can use the exact same data or perhaps add more data. At the physician level, you want to basically get physician level, patient level, longitudinal behavioral data over time, 2, 3, 5 years, whatever you can get. Now, in some disease states that will not be possible or available, but where it is available, you apply certain heuristic rules to this data. So if you want to understand peak and rule, maybe is there anything you can, any type of rule you can look at that will help you say these physicians, based on their data, are definitely using heuristic called peak and rule, and others physicians are not. So this is basically how you try to kind of back from behavioral data, you try to back into why they're behaving the way they're behaving based on certain heuristics. Let's take an example. In this example, let's say we were trying to identify if a certain segment of physicians are using a heuristic called rule of consistency, which basically means that people can sometimes start making decisions over and over again to protect a psychological image they have created of themselves. In their own mind, they stand for something. This is how they do certain things. This is who they are as a person. And anytime they deviate from that image that they have of themselves, they kind of don't feel right. It doesn't feel good to them. So they stick to that image, even though it's not the right thing to do. So if you were trying to figure out if a physician uses rule of consistency heuristic, and perhaps even irrationally, you might see, let me take a look at their data at the patient level. Let me look at first line, second line, and third line treatment data and see how many of their patients are they treating, mostly kind of using the same first line, second line, third line options. They wait for 6 months after first line. So they kind of start with metformin if this was diabetes, and then maybe they wait for a couple of years, and then they put them on a DPP4, and then they wait for another year, and then they put them on a SGLT2 or whatever. So that's an example, of course, right? So, but you can use that as a rule. The rule becomes looking at the progression of the disease and the treatment algorithm and seeing what classes of drugs they're using, and what percentage of patients in their practice are being treated in pretty much the same way. And you can set thresholds for if it's 50%, 60%, 70%, whatever the numbers are, depending on the numbers, we will consider this physician as a high propensity for rule of consistency heuristic. So this is kind of how you would use data to back up from the data into heuristics. And once you have the heuristics, then everything else you don't need if you're going to focus on heuristics-based messaging. You can even take this all the way to, now you want to train your reps on how to sell to heuristics. Your selling guide can be basically based on heuristics. Your challenger selling model can be incorporated, heuristics can be incorporated into that. Here's an example of how, let's say a rep is trained to ask a physician who the rep already knows uses egocentric bias heuristic because it's loaded in Viva. And now the rep is actually trained to ask a question like this. Dr. John, I know from talking to the nurses in your practice that you're able to get a lot of your rheumatoid arthritis patients into remission. What are the biggest differences in how you treat versus other physicians? Like, what are you doing that you're able to be so much more successful? This is feeding this physician's egocentric bias and it's getting them to talk, and which is what the rep exactly wants before they start detailing the drug. So, and we found that good reps actually very intuitively understand decision heuristics. As soon as you explain a heuristic to them, they can almost instantly think about some physicians in their territory who are using that heuristic. They may not know the science behind that whole thing, but they kind of sort of, if they've been selling for a while, they actually understand these principles already. So they actually embrace this whole way of thinking, and they are very open to the idea of being trained to heuristics. That's what we found, at least in all of our work. Now, this is where the rubber meets the road, which is you have a segmentation. For each segment, you know what their heuristics are. Now, how do you create segment-based messaging? So now we'll focus on that part. So let's just say, and you can even take your existing messaging that may not have been written to segments, and now you can create segment-based messaging based on their heuristics, i.e. heuristicize your messaging down to the segment level. So let's say this is a message that you already had. Product X plus Y significantly prolonged progression-free survival versus product X in the clinical trial. So it's basically just using X alone or adding Y to X, you get much better, PFS. So nothing complicated, very, very simple, straightforward, almost like indication-like message. If you were going to deliver this message to segment one, instead of saying this, you talk to their complication bias heuristic, if that's one of their dominant heuristics. You can just tweak the message a teeny tiny little bit by adding a few words here and there that will now suddenly, when they read it, it sounds different to them. It sounds much more relevant to them. Why? Because they're already using complication bias heuristic to make decisions. If segment two is using ambiguity aversion heuristic to make decisions, you can now, again, very carefully include some language that can talk to their ambiguity aversion heuristic, and so on and so forth. So for each segment based on their top 1, 2, 3 heuristics, you can actually create some, segment-based versions of your core messages, and the reps would now know, why am I not just delivering this message to everyone, right? Why am I changing up the message, or why is my message different in Viva when I go see Dr. Jones? Well, they would already know and understand this because they would know that Dr. Jones is driven by complication bias. And actually, once they know that, they almost don't even need, the precise, like they'll know how to even add some of the language as they talk to the physician that talks to that complication bias heuristic. Of course, you want them to execute the messages as they're trained, but they're going to have conversations too. Now, you can take this all the way. This is an example of where a core message has now been executed in 4 different ways. How about you did a brand new segmentation and you have 4 segments, and for each segment, you now know their kind of dominant heuristics. These are all heuristics. Yeah? So you could, for a given segment, you could actually, now that you know what the heuristics are, you could actually write very specific heuristics-based messages, and you can have an inventory of messages for every segment. You can have an inventory that sits in the middle here in this empty space, which would be a cross-segment inventory also. So if your segment one has illusion of control, and this is a diabetes category, let's say, if your segment one physicians have illusion of control, a message to them might read something like this: make a difference in your diabetes patients' lives by helping them reach A1C goals with product X. So it's not about the patients, it's about me, the physician, and feeding my illusion of control. Now, if your segment two physicians had actor observer bias heuristic, was one of the heuristics they are using, you could, which means the physician kind of sort of blames the patient for their own diabetes. You could write a message like this: patients need to take more ownership of their A1C. Product X can give them the boost they need. So this is something that can be done now, taken all the way where your entire message map in Viva can be loaded based on each segment. That you could have mini inventories of messages down to the segment level. The rep would not have to do any extra work to figure out how to customize the messaging from one segment to the other, and so on and so forth. It would already be mapped. All they actually need to be done, all that needs to be done is that they need to be trained to some extent to better understand why they're being asked to deliver a illusion of control message to segment one. So that would become part of their sales training. Let's quickly look at a case study, how this actually came together. Segment-based messaging, how going from a segmentation that already existed to a segment-based messaging, and then actually looking at the results in the marketplace. So this study comes from, this is still the pharmaceutical industry, but the other side of pharma, which is a PBM, where the goal of this entire project was to actually help the world's largest PBM at that time to convert more of their chronic care patients who are taking some kind of a chronic medication, from retail pharmacy to mail order pharmacy. And they had 24 plus million people like that whose lives of pharmacy benefits they were managing. And a lot of these patients were not converting their scripts. They had like less than 20% of patients had converted. And this is after like years and years of messaging by an internal agent. Literally, this company had a team of 35 plus people, internal agency, who was constantly messaging to people, trying to give them very persuasive reasons why they should switch. It's cheaper, it's more convenient, it's more accurate prescription filling, there's no errors. You just, any which way you can think about it, it's like a no-brainer to switch, but most people don't switch. So this project, basically, first we started with the segmentation, identified the heuristics of each segment, then wrote messages to each segment, then conducted research to test those messages with those segments, identify a winning message bundle for every segment, and then campaigns were executed in market to each segment and to see the results. So here's an example of segment one, let's just say. What kind of messaging? This is a message bundle. So you can kind of sort of see this would get converted into some kind of a campaign, like a direct mail, email, those kinds of, digital banner ad, whatever. Like a surround sound campaign would be based on this bundle of messages. Think of like a turf analysis like you normally do. So there are claims here, there are benefit statements here, there are call to action messages here. Interestingly, for segment one, many of the messages in their optimal message bundle are based on diffusion of responsibility heuristic and also complication bias heuristic. So this is a segment who basically kind of sort of expects somebody else to do all the legwork that is necessary if to switch their prescriptions from retail pharmacy to mail order pharmacy. If I have to do it, no, thank you. I'm not going to switch that. So they just kind of sort of assume or expect somebody else to actually do all the legwork. In fact, if something goes wrong, they expect that party to actually do all the legwork to take him back also, which is something that you see in some of the messages. Loss aversion heuristic. was also an important heuristic in some of the messages in this bundle. And then a couple other heuristics had messages in their bundle were based on some other heuristics also. So there were message bundles, optimal message bundles for every segment. There were 3 different segments, segment 1, 2, 3. This is basically increasing order of how many prescriptions they were taking and how complicated their disease had become. Or multiple diseases or conditions. And for each segment, there were different, there was a different kind of surround sound campaign that was planned. And there's a very large in-market test of over 25 million touch points done through email, direct mail, outbound telesales scripts, etc. And the results of this campaign were basically measured in 2 ways. First, the company looked at how many, it actually looks on the right-hand side first. What percentage of patients who received certain messaging converted their prescriptions from retail pharmacy to mail order pharmacy? And then they also looked at what percentage of total prescriptions were converted. So because some patients are taking only 1 prescription, others are taking 4. And if you convert a patient who takes 4, all of their prescriptions, that's a much bigger benefit to the business. So the results were really impressive. You can see control messaging represents the messaging that was being used today or has been historically the best messaging they had ever had, whatever campaign they picked internally. The new messaging, segment 1 received a campaign based on the messaging based on their heuristics. Segment 2 received a different campaign based on their heuristics, and so on and so forth. And you can see the improvement, the lift from the control was very significant, somewhere in the range of 2 to 6 times better conversion rates, whether you look at the number of patients converted or the number of prescriptions converted. Either way, it was very, very significant in how much improvement was achieved by appending segment heuristics to their segmentation, writing messages to the heuristics, creating heuristics-based messaging campaigns, and then executing that in the marketplace. So hopefully this is an example to kind of demonstrate how this all comes together. So to recap, if you want to make your segmentation more actionable, you have a segmentation, you believe it's a good segmentation, the team buys into the segmentation, but you're not messaging to the different segments differently. You want to consider potentially the idea of applying decision heuristics to your segmentation. Heuristics can be a unifying tool that basically can allow everyone who's using the segmentation to go from to segment-based messaging to use the same tool. The people who are creating the segments, they can use decision heuristic science to create the segments. The people who are creating messages for the segments, they can use decision heuristic science to literally write language in the messages to heuristics. The people who are creating the target list and putting each customer into a segment, they can use heuristics. And finally, the people who are training the reps or executing campaigns, they can actually use the same tool, the same science to customize. In case of reps, they can help train the reps to have better understand decision heuristics of each segment and therefore then execute the messaging in the field for each segment in the best way. So we'll close here. I want to thank you again for joining. Hopefully this session was interesting and valuable to you. We're going to open up a Q&A session here. We encourage everybody to participate and ask questions. I went through everything pretty quickly so that we have as much time as possible for Q&A. This is Gaurav Kapoor with Heuristics, and I'll switch over to Q&A now.